Okay, so we start with the idea that cyber activities, whatever they are, and you're going to talk about this, and I'm going to say a few words, that they should be regulated in one way or another. How does one go about in international law to regulate? There are two, broadly speaking, two different kinds of regulatory techniques in which we can try to persuade people in these ways. One we could call rules per se, and the other one we could call standards. Rules, I call them those kinds of directives which have bright lines, which are clearly applicable, which are easy to use, are very predictable, and give security to people moving around them. What could be those kinds of rules? Well, traffic rules are like that. If it's red light, you have to stop. There's no discretion, as we say. You have to stop. Whether or not you're taking somebody to a hospital because they're ill, or you have to stop. Maybe you still have to drive there, but you get fined nevertheless. You say to the police, well, it was an emergency, and say, well, yeah, but, you know, a rule is a rule is a rule. Rules are therefore necessary for social life. They create predictability. We can trust each other. We abide by the rules. Now, but rules are often really problematic. And especially in international world, they are problematic. Because they apply also to cases that the rule makers actually didn't come to think when they enacted the rule. And the rulemaking always takes place by reference to past practice. We legislate in order to, because we remember stuff that happened in the past. Rules often bind us in situations where we don't want to be bound. And therefore, we often insert in the rule itself broad expressions such as act in a reasonable way. A contract is binding if it's made in good faith. There are lots of discussions in international law that turn around the choice between rules and standards. We need those standards, words such as reasonable, good faith, as appropriate, and so on. We need those because we don't want to be bound down by rules when the rules come and hit us in the face. Give me an example. Okay, here is one. This would be Article 51, it's a famous example among international lawyers, Article 51 of the United Nations Charter on self-defense. When the drafters of the UN Charter were thinking about situations where we could allow people to use force, they wanted to make that opportunity as narrow as possible, the threshold as low as possible, and the criterion for the use of force as clear as possible so that there would be no misuse. So they wrote into Article 51 on self-defense that you can engage in self-defense if an armed attack occurs. So that's a really rule-like provision. You can go there out, it's an empirical fact. Did an armed attack occur or didn't it? And so everybody congratulated themselves in San Francisco. This is now really binding. The problem was, you see, that during the League of Nations, in the covenant of the League, what was prohibited was going to war. But what's war? The Japanese had been a year in Manchuria before the League of Nations noticed that there was a war going on. They had to send a commission, the Lytton Commission, to Manchuria to see, well, actually, the Japanese said, no, it's just a police operation. What, war? No, we wouldn't. So it took a year. And of course, the experience with Ethiopia, similar. So now they wanted to have clear-cut thing, red light, if an armed attack occurs. But 5 minutes thereafter, they came to think, well, but what if I can only prevent the armed attack by striking first? What if it's a nuclear weapon, for instance? Do I have to sit here in Washington and wait until the armed attack occurs? Well, I'm sorry, but then it's already too late to self-defend because I'm dead. And so, in a number of cases, fortunately not real cases, but hypothetical cases, including in the International Court of Justice, lawyers have said, well, you can't read that so literally. you have to take into account these situations that you can only defend yourself before the attack has occurred. At the time when I was in the foreign ministry, we speculated about, at that time, Euro missiles. And whether, a country like Finland would have to wait until a Euro, or the contrary to Euro missile, might fall, or might we have to actually strike first? And I remember I was there with our military, and I was saying, well, this is what the charter says, but, we can't take it so seriously. They were a little bit shocked for a couple of minutes, but then they realized that so the UN Charter is not a suicide pact, as we say. So we didn't conduct it in order to shoot ourselves in the foot. So now everybody accepts that you don't take it literally. So if the attack is imminent, there's no other way, what used to be a rule became a standard. And standards are really good because they give us the opportunity to think hard about the situation. They don't generalize. They look at the situation, allow equitable adjustment. Now, however, there's a problem because they are binding, as I put here, only more or less. They allocate much decision to the law applier. The idea is, of course, that the legislator acts a rule, and therefore the legislator, the United Nations member states, for example, they can control what happens out there. But if the provision has the form of a standard, then they just say, oh, you decide, because you are reasonable men, you International Court of Justice, you committee, whatever, Security Council, you use your discretion. Well, in some situations, that's a useful deference. In other situations, it isn't. So that's the basic set of choices we have when we write something like a Tallinn manual. We would want really to regulate, but then when we think about these situations, it's kind of unpredictable and the technology changes, so we have to insert words when reasonable, when appropriate, etc. So here are some examples of standards from the Tallinn manual. Tallinn Rule 7, the principle of due diligence, which is already a standard, requires the state to take all measures that are feasible. Feasible in accordance with whom, in the circumstances, as determined by whom, serious adverse consequences. Serious for whom, and who decides? The second Tallinn Rule, a definition of a cyber attack, so now it's really hardcore. Cyber attack is a cyber operation that's reasonably expected to cause injury or death. So an attack on a country is, a bad thing if it's reasonably expected to cause some little damage or more damage, discretion. So Tallinn Rule 73, the right to use force in self-defense arises, and this is what I was telling you about, if the attack is imminent, and it's further subjected to requirement of immediacy. If you are the one targeted, then of course the immediacy is now, but if it's somebody else that's being targeted, and maybe it's your adversary, it's not such a great problem if that person is targeted. Actually, it's kind of, well, I don't go there. So, and countermeasures, the famous idea of countermeasures into which the idea of proportionality has been written. So, the 500 pages of the Tallinn II manual, which I for the first time in my life opened a week ago, is full of these kinds of statements. My point is not to ridicule them. My point is to say that there is something inevitable and obvious about this, and that it's not a problem that can be resolved by more words. The more words, the less soluble the problem is. So when the Tallinn manual moved from the 250 to 500 pages, it became indecipherable. And I would say, as a generalist international lawyer, having done almost everything, done something in almost every field in international law, I find this completely inoperable as a legal instrument. Okay, so how to think about rules and standards? So rules work when there is no solidarity in the community in which there's rule, because you don't trust anybody. So a rule is a rule, the red light. You don't ask drivers to think for themselves. If you did, of course, the code of the road could be written well, all drivers should behave reasonably and in good faith and think hard about what's safe and what's not. That could be, in some sense, that is what the rules of the road want to do. But we can't trust each other because, of course, I can always reason in a brilliant way, but they can't. So suspicion is high. Rules are good because they bind, they bind. So here is the rule, no question. And they work well when the matter is a routinized behavior and not a rare occurrence. After the Kosovo bombings in 1999, I participated in a number of debates, including under the UN Secretary General. I was also a member of a Danish and a Dutch expert committee that looked into the possibility of regulating humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect, to have rules on that. Because if the law only says, well, you can use force if there's a large humanitarian crisis and no other alternatives are available, that's too much of a standard. That's too open-ended. That allows everybody who has the means to intervene. And so we wanted to figure out whether it's possible to find a rule that would really bind the Americans and NATO. Because, I mean, Finland wouldn't intervene in the Crimea, for instance. But so the rule here concerns only a few people. And it concerns things of great importance, massacres, atrocities, maybe genocide. So can you regulate a genocide by rule? Let's say you have a rule. What could be a rule that would clearly, like a red light, regulate genocide? Here would be a rule. When 1,000 people are killed, then the holy force can intervene. 1,000. That would be an excellent rule, because it's a red light. 1,000. Now, why didn't we enact something like that? That's just an example, an extreme example, of course. But it shows you how we actually don't want rules when it's a matter of great importance. Now imagine that the UN General Assembly once enacted that rule. What would it lead to? Imagine that there's a tyrant who wants to get rid of a minority population because she wants to set up a holiday resort where they live. And she turns to her legal advisor saying, well, I just want to annihilate those people in order to have my pool set in where they've lived for the past 5,000 years. What would the legal advisor say? The legal advisor would say, well, Madam Tyrant, just last week this international convention was concluded which says that if 1,000 are killed, then there will be a holy intervention. But then the tyrant will turn to the legal advisor and say, but you're the legal advisor. Your task is not to tell me what I can't do. Your task is to tell me what I can do within the limits of the rules. And then the legal advisor would say, well, actually, this is very easy because the rule is so clear. So this is what I suggest to you. You go to every little house of that minority population, you take the blue-eyed under 3-year-olds and you cut their heads. And when you come to 999, stop. And I bet that they will have left before you've gotten to 999. And now notice, the killing, and the intervention force is there, just outside the boundary. They are counting. 1, 2, 3. They have all the weapons, It's a really massive military operation. They're preparing 5, 6, 7. Now, of course, that's ridiculous. What I'm pointing out to you is that in this case, in this hypothetical, where we have a rule, and the rule tries to regulate a single situation of great importance, then the rule is actually less important than the necessity of acting now. So a responsible general of the Holy Military Force would say, stop counting, go in. And of course the rule would be stupid. It's the rule that would kill those 999. Okay, so rules cannot be really used when it's a single big thing, because the rule in international world is rarely more important than the absolute necessity of acting now to protect some interest that's really vital. Why would I let the rule destroy a value that's so important for me, that maybe involves lives, great economic losses, when the international world isn't a world where we bow our heads regularly in front of rules? So we don't enact rules in those situations. A rule such as red light produces a good social consequence because it's a routinized behavior that's being regulated. It's true that some people actually may get fined, even if reasonably thinking that was a little bit of an injustice, but those injustices take place in the margins of the rule, whereas the great social benefit is the routine that now operates in a credible, predictable, and safe fashion. So in the international world, these matters are not matters of routine. They are single incidents, and therefore we need discretion. We don't have solidarity. So ideas about reasonableness, good faith, when it's appropriate, they work well in a world where there is solidarity, when we can expect that the law applier thinks about the world a little bit like we as legislators. So we can say, let the judges decide, let the committee decide, because by and large they are, they think like we, etc. We trust them. So here is a typical regulatory situation where you cannot use rules. This is an article from the UN Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses. That convention provides that there shall be a principle of equitable utilization. So that's a standard. That's the main rule of the main directive of the convention, and it is formulated as a standard. It's not formulated as a rule because there are different watercourses in the world, and you cannot just from Geneva or from New York, say, well, this is how you should act in respect of some particular river. But you can say that you should use the river in an equitable fashion. However, everybody, when that convention was concluded, realized that that's just too open-ended. If the convention tells people that you should be equitable, what do these people learn that they didn't know before the convention? So the regulatory technique then is to give examples, and in this case, the standard points to a weighing scale. So it's a balancing exercise here. In order to determine what counts as equitable utilization, you take into account all relevant factors and circumstances, including 1, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So you take into account everything. And then in the application of this article, you enter into consultation. You see, it presumes that there is a solidarity between the riparian states, between the watercourse states. So whether that assumption is justified, I don't know. I'm thinking of rivers between Finland and Norway, and then rivers between India and Pakistan. And, well, cooperation in one context clearly is easier than in another context. I'm particularly struck by paragraph 3. The weight to be given to each factor is to be determined by its importance in comparison with that of other relevant factors. Now, here are serious diplomats who have sat years in order to get to this convention. All the factors have to be considered together and a conclusion reached on the basis of the whole, and the rabbit comes out of the hat. Again, the point is not to ridicule multilateral treaty making. The point is to say, well, it's really hard. And the diplomats who come to those situations have always 2 instructions with which they have to approach the regulatory matter. Sometimes those instructions are written. Most of the time they are not, because they are diplomats, you are diplomats, I used to be one. So you know what these 2 instructions are. What are they? Well, here's the first instruction. Whatever you agree to, don't agree to anything that might strike at your state in some future circumstance. And now when you have that inscribed in your mind and in your professional practice, then you always want to leave the door open, at some corner, so that, because you don't know, the future is different from the past. And your country might be targeted by environmental pollution, your river, or by an armed attack, or maybe by a cyber attack. And you don't want to prevent your country from taking action, whatever action it needs to take then. So instruction 1 says, make it open-ended so that we can always save ourselves. What's the other instruction that everybody has? It's this. Try as hard as you can to bind every conceivable adversary that you have. Okay. So it has to be really binding. Red light. Now when the schizophrenic diplomats sit there around the table and try to think with those 2 instructions, on the one hand, leave as much room to maneuver for my state, and bind as hard as you can every other state. If you have both of these in your mind, then something like this will emerge. And when I read the 500 pages of the Tallinn manual, I could not think of anything else apart from this.